August 19, 1945, Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. The circle closed at dawn. 12 American camp hounds moved with disciplined silence, their paws pressing into dust still cool from the night. The women inside the wire stood frozen, breath held, eyes fixed on the animals that had haunted their nightmares since childhood. Low growls rolled through the air like distant thunder. This was the moment they had been warned about their entire lives. This was where mercy ended and punishment began. They braced for teeth, for blood, for the inevitable cruelty their instructors had promised would follow capture. The dogs sat. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Share this with someone who values history told with truth and respect. The handler stood motionless behind the animals, leashes slack, faces unreadable. No commands were shouted. No rifles were raised. The silence pressed down harder than any threat ever could. For women raised on stories of enemy savagery, this restraint was more terrifying than violence. It didn't fit the script. It didn't match the ending they had prepared themselves to endure. And in that suspended moment, as morning light cut through the Wisconsin pine trees and touched the faces of women who had crossed an ocean expecting death, something began to crack, not the wire, not the ground beneath their feet, but the certainty they had carried like armor since the day they first put on their uniforms. This wasn't punishment. This was something they had no word for. Act I. The architecture of fear. The women had been taught about dogs long before they ever saw these hounds. In military training facilities across Japan, instructors spoke of enemy animals the way priests spoke of demons. Dogs were instruments of torture, they said. Americans unleashed them on prisoners for sport. They were trained to recognize fear itself, to attack hesitation, to tear apart anyone who showed weakness. These stories were not presented as warnings. They were delivered as facts. By 1943, as the war turned against Japan, auxiliary women received increasingly grim instructions. Nurses, radio operators, clerks, translators, all were told the same thing. Surrender was worse than death. Capture meant humiliation so complete it would stain your family name for generations. Better to die with honor than live as a prisoner. The ideology of Bushido, once reserved for samurai warriors, had been simplified and mass-produced for total war. It now applied to everyone. Every citizen carried the same burden: endure, obey, and if necessary, disappear rather than surrender. For women, this burden carried additional weight. Male soldiers faced shame if captured. Women faced something their culture suggested was unspeakable. So they memorized the lessons. They practiced stoicism. They prepared themselves psychologically for an enemy who would see them not as human beings but as objects to be used and discarded. When American forces advanced across the Pacific, these women served in field hospitals, communications posts, and administrative centers. They worked until supply lines collapsed, until bombs fell closer, until retreat became impossible. Surrender, when it came, felt like stepping off a cliff in slow motion. August 1945. The war ended with 2 atomic flashes and an emperor's radio voice breaking centuries of divine silence. Japanese forces across the Pacific laid down arms. Among them were approximately 200 women auxiliaries who found themselves under American custody, processed through temporary facilities, then transported to internment camps in the continental United States. Fort McCoy in Wisconsin became home to several dozen of these women. They arrived expecting the worst. Instead, they found something that didn't fit any category they understood. Barracks with beds, meals served on trays, medical stations that treated injuries without interrogation, guards who gave orders without rage, and dogs, always dogs. The camp hounds at Fort McCoy were Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, trained for perimeter security and patrol work. Standard military working dogs, valued for discipline and reliability. They were not attack dogs in the sense the women had been warned about. They were detection animals, taught to alert handlers to threats, to maintain order through presence rather than violence. But the women didn't know that. They only knew what they'd been taught. One woman, a former nurse named Akiko, later recalled her first morning in the camp. She had spent the night rigid with fear, expecting assault or execution at any moment. When dawn came and the dogs appeared circling the yard where new arrivals stood for processing, her legs nearly gave out. This was it, she thought, the moment every instructor had warned them about. The dogs circled once, then sat, then lay down in the shade. Akiko's hands shook for hours afterward, not from relief but from confusion so profound it felt like nausea. Nothing made sense. If the enemy was as cruel as promised, why was she still breathing? If the dogs were instruments of torture, why were they sleeping? The other women asked the same questions silently. They watched American guards move through their routines, roll call, work assignments, meal distribution, with procedural calm. No one was beaten for moving too slowly. No one was starved as punishment. Mistakes were corrected with gestures and firm words, not fists. This orderliness was destabilizing. The women had been prepared for chaos, for sadism unleashed. Instead, they found structure, rules posted and enforced consistently, guards who rotated shifts like clockwork, dogs that patrolled on schedule, never deviating, never aggressive without cause. It was the absence of cruelty that broke them, not immediately, but slowly over days and weeks, as the gap between expectation and reality widened beyond what belief could bridge. One afternoon, a handler put a dog through basic commands within view of the barracks. Sit. Heel. The dog obeyed instantly, rewarded with a treat and a scratch behind the ears. No anger. No dominance asserted through pain. Just training, calm and methodical. A woman watching from the window felt something inside her chest tighten and release. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she recognized that it contradicted everything she'd been told. If control could exist without cruelty, if power could be exercised without rage, then what did that mean about the world she'd been raised in? The dogs became the lens through which the women began to see their captors differently, not as monsters, but as men doing a job, men who fed their animals before themselves, men who checked paws for cuts and cleaned water bowls without being ordered, men who spoke to dogs in low, affectionate tones that sounded nothing like the harsh commands the women had grown up hearing. This wasn't the enemy they'd been promised, and that realization was more frightening than any threat. Act 2. The Unraveling. The days at Fort McCoy followed a rhythm that was both mundane and unbearable. Morning bell, roll call, work assignments, meals, medical checks, lights out. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was precisely what made it so disorienting. Food arrived 3 times a day, not scraps, not punishment rations. Actual meals with protein, vegetables, bread. Some women ate slowly, suspicious of poison. Others devoured everything, bodies overriding minds. Within 2 weeks, faces began to fill out. Coughs subsided. Wounds that had festered for months healed under medical care that was thorough and impersonal. Guilt arrived with every improvement. How could they accept food while families back home boiled weeds? How could they sleep on mattresses while cities burned? The shame was crushing, but survival demanded cooperation from flesh that no longer asked permission from ideology. One woman, a radio operator named Hannah, pushed her breakfast tray away one morning, hands trembling. "I can't," she whispered. Another woman across the table reached over and steadied her hand. "Refusing doesn't help anyone else," she said quietly. The logic was cold, but it kept them alive. The dogs continued their patrols, indifferent to the women's internal struggles. They walked the fence line morning and evening, noses testing the air, bodies relaxed but alert. Over time, the women learned their patterns. The younger shepherd always stopped at the east corner to investigate the same bush. The older Malinois preferred shade near the equipment shed. These animals had personalities, routines, preferences. Recognizing that made it harder to fear them. Familiarity is a solvent. It dissolves the edges of terror, leaving something softer but more complicated. The women stopped flinching every time a dog passed. They began to differentiate between the animals. This one was more cautious, that one more curious. Fear became wariness, then observation, then something approaching neutrality. But neutrality toward the enemy felt like betrayal. The women clung to each other, seeking reassurance that they weren't losing themselves. Late at night, they whispered about what waited for them at home. Would neighbors understand? Would families forgive survival? The questions had no good answers, so they were asked over and over, a ritual of shared anxiety. Small acts of humanity from the guards made everything worse. A door held open instead of slammed. A nod of acknowledgment instead of a barked order. Soap that appeared near the wash basins without explanation, real soap, thick and white, smelling faintly of lavender. One woman washed her hands and stood frozen, staring at the lather. She hadn't seen real soap in over a year. The simple act of cleanliness felt like stepping across a moral boundary. To accept comfort from the enemy was to participate in her own corruption, or so she'd been taught. Yet her skin remembered what it felt like to be clean. Her body responded before her mind could intervene. She scrubbed her face, her arms, the back of her neck. When she finished, she felt lighter and more ashamed than she had in months. The handlers never explained themselves. They went about their duties with professional detachment, speaking among themselves in English the women couldn't understand. But body language crossed all barriers. The women watched how handlers interacted with the dogs, patient, consistent, occasionally affectionate. They watched how guards treated each other, casual jokes, shared cigarettes, the easy camaraderie of men who weren't constantly performing dominance. This normalcy was dangerous. It suggested that the enemy was ordinary, and if the enemy was ordinary, then the war became something more complicated than good versus evil. Weeks passed. The women's bodies grew stronger while their certainties weakened. They began to notice individual guards. One had a scar along his jawline, Another whistled tunelessly while walking his route. A handler always checked his dog's paws before starting patrol, kneeling in the dust to examine each pad carefully. These details accumulated like sediment, building layers of recognition that couldn't be ignored. The enemy had faces now. Habits, small rituals of care. One afternoon, Akiko watched a handler praise his dog after a successful training exercise. The animal's tail wagged furiously, body wiggling with joy. The handler laughed not cruelly, not mockingly, but with genuine pleasure. The sound carried across the yard, light and unguarded. Akiko felt anger surge unexpectedly. How dare he laugh while her world lay in ruins? But beneath the anger was something worse, curiosity. What kind of life produced such ease? What did it feel like to laugh without guilt? The question lodged itself in her mind and wouldn't leave. At night, the women lay awake listening to sounds that had once terrified them. Boots on gravel, a dog shifting position, wind moving through wire. These sounds no longer sent panic racing through their veins. They had become the soundtrack of daily life, familiar and almost comforting. That comfort was terrifying. To grow accustomed to captivity felt like losing the war all over again, this time from the inside. The dogs, once symbols of inevitable violence, had transformed into something else entirely. They marked time. They represented routine. They reminded the women daily that force existed here but was deliberately withheld. Power was present, controlled, and used sparingly. This restraint was the most unsettling lesson of all. It suggested competence. It suggested a system built on something other than fear and punishment. It suggested that the enemy understood discipline in ways the women's own commanders never had. One morning during roll call, a dog broke from its handler briefly, distracted by movement beyond the fence. The handler's command cut through the air sharp, immediate. The dog stopped mid-stride, returned to heel, sat. The handler's face showed no anger, only focus. He praised the dog quietly and resumed formation. A woman watching felt something shift inside her chest. This was control without humiliation, authority without rage. It was possible to enforce order without terror. The realization didn't bring comfort. It brought a question that gnawed at everything she'd been taught. What if strength and cruelty weren't the same thing? Act 3. The moment that changed everything. Late September 1945. The announcement came quietly. Repatriation was underway. Ships were being prepared. The women would be going home. The news should have brought relief. Instead, it brought fear. Home meant questions they couldn't answer. Bodies that had survived. Minds that no longer fit what their country expected of them. How could they explain a place where the enemy fed them, treated them, allowed dignity behind wire? How could they speak of dogs that did not attack, guards who did not strike? Silence felt safer. Silence had always been safer. The women spent their final weeks at Fort McCoy, suspended between survival and return. They had endured capture, the collapse of certainty. Now they faced a world that would not understand what they had lived through. One evening, Akiko stood by the fence watching the dogs complete their patrol. Calm, precise, controlled. She remembered the first morning, how the dogs had circled them in terrifying silence. She had been certain death was seconds away. Instead, the dogs had sat and waited. That moment shattered something fundamental. The dogs were never the threat. Certainty was. the rigid belief that the enemy could only be monstrous. Once that belief cracked, it could not be repaired. You could not unsee restraint after witnessing it. You could not unknow dignity after being granted it. In early October, the women boarded trains east, then ships bound for Japan. During the long journey, they rehearsed what they would say. Neutral expressions, edited stories, captivity, waiting, release, nothing more. They decided, without discussion, to remain silent. Speaking would invite judgment. It would require explaining survival, why they ate enemy food, accepted enemy medicine, endured care, when they had been taught to expect cruelty. The ships reached Japan in late October. The country was hollowed by defeat. Cities burned. Hunger was everywhere. Hope was rare. The women returned to broken hometowns and fractured families. They tried to resume lives interrupted by war and altered by captivity. They spoke little, but they carried a shared understanding. The dogs haunted their memories not as monsters, but as proof that power could coexist with restraint, that authority did not always require violence. This knowledge did not excuse the war, but it did something more dangerous. It made them question certainty itself. That realization was irreversible. Resolution. December 1985. 40 years after the war. A reunion brought together women who had served in the Pacific. Many came. Many stayed away. The memories shared were careful, worn smooth by time. Late that night, a small group gathered quietly. Akiko, now in her 60s, was asked about the internment camp. The question lingered. "The dogs?" she said. "I remember the dogs." They nodded. "We thought they would kill us," Akiko continued. "Everything we were taught said they would, but they didn't. They guarded. They didn't harm. That difference changed everything." Another woman whispered, "We were more afraid of the kindness than the cruelty. Kindness meant we'd been lied to." They never spoke publicly of that night. The truth remained private. Behind wire and watchful dogs, they learned what their country never meant them to learn. Fear is a tool of control, and questioning it is the first act of freedom. The dogs guarded more than a fence. They guarded a question, and once asked, it could never be taken back.